Hello and welcome to interest.co.nz. I'm Junaid Tibshirani and today I'm joined by JBWere strategist Bernard Doyle. Thanks for coming in, Bernard.
Pleasure.
Right, so today we're talking equity markets, and back in 2010 you came in for an interview with my colleague Gareth Vaughan, and you said you routinely got feedback from investors that the New Zealand equity market isn't big enough, diverse enough or liquid enough to sort of keep them investing domestically. 7 years on, is that still the case?
I think a lot's changed for the better since then. I do think back in 2010, putting in the context, it was after the GFC, so markets were subdued around the world. We had KiwiSaver, but it hadn't really got to a size where it was something that you heard from fund managers as a source of support and flows into funds. Super fund was around, but again a much smaller size. And so and we didn't have the mixed ownership model, so we didn't have the SOE floats. And our turnover in our market was very low, and I was really concerned at the time that this could go. When I looked at the peer group back then, you really had to look into the emerging economies to find share markets of a similar size, as a proportion of the economy. So it looked like we were either going to go down the plug hole or things had to change. And bringing that all together, trading volumes have improved, market capitalisation to GDP has improved. So I'm happier than I was then. Yeah,
well actually back then you were comparing the NZX's market capitalisation to GDP. That ratio was comparable to that of Greece, which would have been a bit concerning. So back 2010 it was the market cap was equivalent to 29% of GDP. Today it's about 48%, so that's a pretty massive increase. Just wondering the extent to which that can be attributed to some of the factors you've outlined, and I guess the strength of the market versus the market actually, New Zealand market actually being overvalued.
Right. Oh look, I think it's probably more the former. So market cap to GDP, as you just pointed out, it's in the 40s now, which is great. And that's the highest level since 2000. Okay. So, that's getting back to where we were before we went through a really tough period. With valuation, you'd say, if you were being harsh, the market might be 20% overvalued, depending on how strict we're going to be about valuations. But and of course we've had 5 years of very good returns. I mean, this has been one of our best ever, if not our best ever, bull market. That's not ended in an 80s type bubble. We've actually had very strong, steady returns over a long period of time. So we'll probably give some of that back at some point, but I'd say by far and away the biggest drivers are those more fundamental drivers, being we've had significant, billions of dollars of new equity supply and billions of dollars of new equity demand, particularly via KiwiSaver. So they're the big changes that have done the heavy lifting from that low 20s to the 40s in terms of market cap to GDP.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so you're not concerned about the market being a wee bit, say 20% overvalued? You don't think there are too many risks associated with that?
Oh, look, I think there's risks, and we've had a view this year that investors need to be careful about their allocation to this market, but that's a 1 to 3 year. That's a tactical view. And you're always going to have, that's just the beauty of shares, right? They go through periods where they're doing very well, and then you get a little bit overheated, and then they probably go, we're due probably for a flat patch here. And there are risks there, of course. But is it a risk that I would be concerned that we take a big leg lower back to where we were, 10 years ago or 7 years ago? I certainly don't think we're in that camp. And again, when you look at the changes that have taken place since 2010, it's KiwiSaver's not going to unravel we're not going to delist these companies we've listed.
Yeah.
So those changes are here to stay. And look, the economy's, again, we wrote earlier in the year about we've had a period of very strong population-driven growth, and that could bite us a little bit over the next 1 to 3 years. But that's not big enough to take us from right back to square one, I don't think.
Yeah, right. And look, Bernard, if we just think about the value of the market, if it's pretty well priced, what do you think is Xero's rationale for jumping ship from the NZX to the ASX?
I don't understand it. So, they clearly have their own rationale that they're happy with. An obvious rationale for saying this market's not doing what it should be for us or for a company is value that's not recognised. So that would be one thing. The other would be the register. So if you're saying I'm struggling to get offshore interest, particularly for a tech company, it should show up in the register. But this is a company where its valuations, and particularly with tech companies, valuations are a dark art. But if you're looking at enterprise value to sales, it's well up there in its peer group of similar companies in the sector. And so hard to say on the basis of valuation that there was a problem to fix there. On the register and coverage issue, and I sort of, New Zealand is a small market with less analysts than a big market. That's just maths. But that would probably show up in a company struggling to populate its register with US tech investors. But this
not a problem.
Doesn't
for Xero?
Appear to be a problem for Xero. I mean, they know better than me. But from the outside looking in, there didn't seem to be an issue to fix from being listed here. So it'll be really interesting to see how the Aussie listing goes. And whether there's, we're all proven wrong, and there's something obvious that was missing in this market. From the outside looking in, there wasn't.
Yeah, sure.
And the flip side with the Australian market is, you got more depth, but you also got more distractions for investors in Australia. It's a very competitive market. There's more analysts, but they're spread thin. What I certainly don't buy is there's a quality differential between this market and analytical quality.
Okay. The CEO of the NZX, Mark Peterson, recently said that since September, the NZX has, in his words, turned over every rock to find a way to keep Xero. And he said it looked at ways to enable Xero to achieve its goal of being listed on the S&P ASX 200 index while maintaining a listing in New Zealand. What do you think the NZX can do to give companies more international exposure, if that's what they would like, while keeping them here?
I mean, it's a tough one, and I'm glad to hear he said that, because this is not as I say, the vulnerability for New Zealand is every company is an important part of our financial ecosystem, and so Xero won't be a terminal hit to our market, but it's a shame to lose it. Again, if I look at what the NZX could have done or can do, really all you're looking for as an investor, and as a global investor, is you want to talk to good analysts. You want a clear and transparent set of rules and a regulator that's doesn't do about turns or unpredictable behaviour. And that obviously flows through to government as well. I just don't look at this and say, yes, here's a bunch of things the NZX could have done to make this not a problem or make this issue not happen. And so, I do think there's, the tougher area for our market is actually the smaller companies, where and the NZX has tried different techniques to nurture smaller companies into the market. So I think that's still that's one area where we haven't fixed it. If there's an easy answer, it would have been found by now.
Yeah, I was talking to CEO of a company last night actually who said that they were struggling to get coverage from analysts, being a smaller company. So, you know, they saw that as a challenge.
Yes.
So I'm not sure if the NZX can play a role in, you know, helping to push that along, or. You know,
yeah, look, I think research coverage, and you know, I think where there's been a little bit of attention is post the GFC in particular, but also even post the tech bubble. You know, you had a move towards a fairly compliance-heavy, you know, world, and that makes research coverage a bit more of a costly exercise, and right. You know, for smaller companies, it's harder for them to get the turnover to justify the brokerage that makes research coverage economic. So to that extent, you know, I guess the NZX has looked at things around helping with independent research coverage. You know, and then there's things beyond their control. For example, when the retail investors historically have been important in, I guess, providing not speculative, but you know, there's an element of a share market that relies on people that are willing to take high risk investments. And in the wealth world, which, you know, we service at JBWere, you got to be really careful about what you're recommending in portfolios. Because, you know, it's wealth, and it's also a stage of life thing of where New Zealand's at generationally, but also the regulatory environment, you know, compels you to be very careful about the sort of companies you're thinking about for portfolios. So all of that, you know, are, I guess, peripheral issues around how it's very hard for us to have nigh on impossible for us to have a repeat of the 80s, which is good, because, you know, back in the day you could list anything, and it didn't have to have really any fundamentals to attract capital. That's impossible now, which is great, but there's a cost to that, which is it's harder for a company to get from very, very small via the market to very, very big. But it's still, you know, it still happens, and it's still something we should absolutely be saying is critical, you know, to the infrastructure of our economy. A lot of this stuff is cyclical, so you can, you know, and I think anyone looking at this, including the NZX, needs to be careful about trying to solve a problem that is ultimately something that will go away as the cycle changes. Right. And so what I'm really referring to there is, you know, in the US, which doesn't have a small share market, last year was their weakest year for new listings in almost a decade. And so quiet activity is not something that's unique to New Zealand, and you know, one of the common attributed causes of that is private equity has grown so exponentially. So the unlisted activity has been and capital's flown into that space so aggressively that it's kind of cannibalised a little bit of the listed sector's ability to do what it traditionally has done. I wouldn't mind assuming that over 5 or 10 years that private equity's probably grown too fast, and globally, not really so much talking about New Zealand, where it was probably too small. But as a global trend, you could see that retrench a little bit over the next 3 to 5 years. It'll be cyclical. Right. As that ebbs, it'll create room for the listed sector to probably regain a bit of its lost ground. Okay, that's an interesting perspective, that balancing and the cycle. The other place that New Zealanders love to put their money is, of course, the property market. Just wondering what your thoughts are on the extent to which you believe central government has a role to play in restructuring the tax system so it is more balanced in such a way that it doesn't favour property investment so much over investment in the equity market. Yeah, look, it's interesting. This used to be the big issue was it was all property, and that was the biggest problem for our share market, was the ease of or the relative advantage of property. I think it's still there to an extent. But if I look at what central government can and has done to make our share market a place where it can thrive and do its, play its role in the economy, most of the big levers I think have been pulled, which is, we have a close to compulsory savings scheme. We have the state as a very important investor, whether it's via the super fund, via ACC, two really big investors that are in the market. And the state has also sold assets, which has fed really important equity supply into the market. When I look at tax, I don't think, and I'm not as a tax expert, but as an investor, when we're recommending and talking to clients about building portfolios, tax doesn't come up. It's not on the top 5 things really as reasons not to have an investment portfolio. I could be being a bit complacent there because we've had a lovely run in the share market here and globally, and so people don't tend to focus on tax so much when when they're getting nice capital gains.
And I guess once they come to you, they've already decided that that's how they'd like to invest. You might not hear from the people who are choosing to go down the property route.
Yes.
More.
Yes, I think that's probably a little bit of that. I think the other thing is people have become more sophisticated, more aware of diversification, and we've had enough scares on the property market here. We haven't had a proper crash, but we've had enough rattles. Yeah. So that I think certainly larger investors are conscious that, just having a whole lot of rental properties or a commercial building as a savings vehicle, or your sole savings vehicle, is not prudent. And if you're really doing all of that for tax purposes, then you must have a very distorted tax system. And so whilst I think there's no doubt there's improvements here with respect to tax and the distortion between asset classes, I don't think it's necessarily the thing that will sit here in 5 years' time and say that's what was going to take us from 45% of GDP to 55 or 60%. I think actually the market here is on the right path. We, in terms of some of the big structural changes that have occurred, and I'd be disappointed if we didn't continue to improve. Not necessarily cyclically, because as I say, we're probably due for a little bit of a quiet patch, but over 5 to 10 years, I think we're on the right track in terms of where the markets are heading.
Right, well, that's actually quite a nice positive note to leave it on. A slightly different tone to the interview that you did with Gareth Vaughan in 2010. So I'm glad we could have had the conversation of the tone that it has been today. So thank you so much, Bernard, for joining us today.
You're welcome.
And I'm Janae Tibbs-Shirani from interest.co.nz.